In the summer of 1587, a ship full of English settlers looked out at the coast of what is now North Carolina and thought, yes, this is where we build our future. Spoiler alert, it was not where they built their future. It was where they vanished so thoroughly that 400 years later, people are still arguing about it on the internet like it happened last Tuesday. To understand how this all went sideways, we have to back up a bit. England, in the late 16th century, was watching Spain get spectacularly rich off the Americas and thinking, understandably, we should be doing that too. Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to Sir Walter Raleigh, a man who had never actually set foot in America himself, but was extremely confident about other people going there on his behalf, which is a very specific kind of 16th century main character energy. Raleigh sent an early group of soldiers and adventurers to Roanoke Island in 1585. That attempt did not end well either, involving conflict with the local Algonquian peoples, dwindling supplies, and a group of Englishmen who, when Sir Francis Drake happened to sail by on his way home from raiding the Spanish, essentially said, "Get us out of here," and left. It was less a colony and more a very tense, very damp camping trip that everyone agreed to stop pretending was going fine. So Raleigh tried again, this time with a twist. Instead of sending only soldiers, he sent families. Men, women, children, the whole domestic package, roughly 115 people in total, under the leadership of a painter and mapmaker named John White. White had actually been on the earlier expedition and had sketched some of the most detailed European drawings of Native American life of the entire century, so he was not exactly a stranger to the region. The idea this time was that families would be more invested in making a colony actually work, rather than just looting the place and hoping for a ship home. Among them was White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, who was pregnant during the voyage. In August of 1587, shortly after landing, she gave birth to a baby girl named Virginiadare, the first English child known to have been born in the Americas. A genuinely historic milestone, and also, tragically, the setup for one of history's great unsolved mysteries, because we genuinely do not know what became of her. Things were difficult almost immediately. Relations with neighboring Native communities were tense, partly because of violence left over from the earlier 1585 expedition, which the newcomers essentially inherited like an unpaid bill someone else had run up at the bar. Food was scarce, farming season was already slipping away, and winter was on its way. And the colonists made a decision that would end up being the last clear, well-documented decision we know anything about. They asked John White to sail back to England and bring reinforcements and supplies. White did not want to leave. He had a daughter and a newborn granddaughter on that island. But the colonists convinced him he was the best person to make the case back home, since he had connections to Raleigh and credibility as the colony's governor. So in late 1587, he boarded a ship and sailed for England, promising to return as quickly as possible. He thought this would take a few months. It took 3 years. And this is where England, frankly, dropped the ball in spectacular, historically inconvenient fashion, because in 1588, the Spanish Armada showed up to invade England, and Queen Elizabeth ordered every available ship pressed into naval defense. Nobody was allowed to sail off on a casual resupply mission to a colony nobody in London was particularly worried about, while Spain was literally at the door. White did try to leave anyway on 2 small vessels the following year, but they got attacked by pirates, of all things, somewhere in the English Channel, and had to limp back to port. So for 3 years, an entire English colony sat across the ocean with absolutely no supply line, no mail, no reinforcements, nothing. While England was busy fighting off Spain like it was the plot of an action movie, nobody on Roanoke had signed up to be extras in. When White finally made it back to Roanoke in August of 1590, on his granddaughter's 3rd birthday no less, he found nothing. Not nothing as in a burned ruin, Nothing as in bodies scattered across the beach, nothing as in the colony was simply, quietly gone. The houses had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed, which suggested a planned, orderly departure rather than a raid or a massacre. There was no sign of struggle, no scattered belongings, none of the chaos you would expect from an attack. The one clue left behind was a single word carved into a wooden post, CROATOAN. Nearby, on a tree, the letters CRO had been carved as well, as if someone had started and then finished the fuller message elsewhere. Before leaving, White had actually arranged a signal system with the colonists specifically for this scenario. If they had to relocate, they would carve their destination somewhere visible. If they left under attack or in distress, they were to add a Maltese cross above the carving as a warning sign. There was no cross anywhere to be found, which is, weirdly, both reassuring and completely unhelpful, because it tells us they probably left calmly and on purpose, but not exactly where they ultimately ended up, or why nobody in 4 centuries has definitively confirmed it. CROATOAN was the name of a nearby island, now known as Hatteras Island, home to the CROATAN people, who had actually been on considerably friendlier terms with the English than some other groups in the region. White wanted to sail there immediately and investigate for himself. This is the part of the story where fate really seems to be trolling everyone involved, because a hurricane rolled in, damaged his ship's anchor cables, and the ship's captain, understandably not wanting to lose the vessel entirely, refused to risk the journey any further. White was forced to abandon the search and sail back to England, never to return to Roanoke again. He died a few years later without ever learning what happened to his daughter and granddaughter. Imagine spending 3 agonizing years desperate to get back to your family, finally arriving, finding a single cryptic word carved into a post as your only clue, and then getting rained out by a hurricane before you could even follow it. History can be remarkably, almost comedically petty sometimes. So, what actually happened to them? This is where things get genuinely interesting, because unlike a lot of historical mysteries that remain mysteries simply due to a total lack of evidence, Roanoke has accumulated a surprising number of plausible answers over the centuries, none of which have been fully and conclusively proven. The leading theory, and the one most historians and archaeologists lean toward today, is also, somewhat disappointingly, the least dramatic. The colonists most likely integrated peacefully with local native communities, quite possibly the CROATAN people on Hatteras Island itself, or other groups further inland along the Chowan River and Albemarle Sound. There is real supporting evidence for this. English accounts from later expeditions, including reports gathered by the Jamestown colonists nearly 20 years afterward, describe encounters with native people who had gray eyes, spoke certain English words, and openly claimed English ancestry. Archaeological digs on Hatteras Island in more recent decades have turned up European artifacts, including a signet ring, gun parts, and fragments of English-made tools mixed directly in with Native American items and dated to roughly the right period. In other words, the most boring and arguably most likely explanation is that the lost colonists were never really lost at all, at least not to the people who actually lived nearby. They simply became part of another already thriving community, which, when your alternative is slowly starving alone in an unfamiliar and increasingly hostile landscape, is a fairly sensible and very human life choice. Other theories are considerably spicier. Some researchers have proposed the colonists split into smaller groups and dispersed further inland, possibly attempting to reach a location roughly 50 miles away that John White himself had mentioned before his departure as a backup relocation site. Archaeological work at a site nicknamed Site X along the Chowan River has uncovered pottery fragments and hardware consistent with English colonial goods from precisely that era, suggesting at least a portion of the colonists may have gone that direction instead of, or in addition to, Hatteras. Then there are the theories that, let's be honest, lean harder into drama than into evidence. A sudden disease outbreak wiping the entire colony out at once. A hostile surprise attack that somehow left zero physical trace behind. Or, if you spend any real time in certain corners of the internet, aliens. Yes, aliens have genuinely been proposed, more than once, with straight faces. Every documentary producer with a flashlight and a dramatic voice just felt a disturbance somewhere. There is, to be extremely and unambiguously clear, no credible evidence whatsoever for extraterrestrial involvement in the disappearance of a 16th century English farming colony. Occam's razor gently suggests that the explanation involving a group of people walked to a nearby island and moved in with people who already knew how to survive there is, on balance, a touch more plausible than aliens. What makes Roanoke endure as a story, though, isn't really the mystery of where everyone physically went. It's the mystery of why nobody ever definitively nailed it down. In an age of exhaustive record-keeping, decades of dedicated archaeology, and now even modern DNA testing, genetic studies have been proposed and attempted over the years to trace potential descendants among communities in the region, including the Lumbee people of North Carolina, some of whom have long maintained their own oral traditions, connecting them to English ancestors from exactly this period. Results so far have been suggestive rather than fully conclusive, which, if you've been paying attention to this entire story, is basically its theme song by now. Every single time historians get tantalizingly close to a definitive answer, the evidence politely, infuriatingly declines to fully cooperate. There's something almost fitting about that. Roanoke wasn't erased in fire or in one single catastrophic event. It didn't end in a dramatic, cinematic moment you could point a camera at and call it a day. It simply dissolved quietly into the landscape, into other communities, into a handful of carved letters on a fence post, and a scattering of artifacts in the dirt, leaving behind just enough evidence to keep people looking for 4 centuries, and just little enough to keep them from ever fully finding it. Today, archaeologists are still digging, geneticists are still testing, and historians are still arguing in academic journals with the same stubborn intensity people usually reserve for arguing about sports on social media. Somewhere between the hurricane that turned John White's ship around and the single word carved into that wooden post, an entire chapter of early American history slipped quietly out of the official record and straight into legend. And maybe that's the real lesson buried inside Roanoke. Sometimes history's greatest mysteries aren't unsolved because something extraordinary and unexplainable happened. They're unsolved because what happened was ordinary enough and human enough to leave almost no trace at all.